Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking today about King David, and I want to spend some extra time on archaeology today. That's my thing. That's my favorite aspect of all of this. And apologetics. One of the in my opinion, one of the great failings of Christian education is apologetics. We come together on Sunday, we're preaching to the choir, literally. A lot of the choir people are here. And we talk about what Christ taught and what it means to our lives, and that's fine. We're Christians. But our kids come here on Sunday, and they hear a couple of hours of Christian education about the Bible, and then they head off to school for the next 6 days. And they're in a secular world that ridicules them if they find out they're Christians. It degrades and attacks Christianity, especially in colleges. And our young people today don't have the tools that they need to be able to respond, or at least in their own minds, understand that the Bible is true. That's apologetics, and it involves things like archaeology, historical documents of various types, texts, legal arguments. And we don't teach these things. So you're going to get some of that today. You're going to get some archaeology about the city of Jerusalem, because the city of Jerusalem is central to the Jewish and the Christian faith. It's the city that David conquered, and the conventional wisdom today is that David never existed. It's the city that David conquered. It's the city in which the temple was built, which has been the focus of the Jewish faith for 3,000 years. It's the city in which Christ was crucified. And in the Jewish faith, it's the city which will initiate and inaugurate the end times. Just as in Christian faith, we have the return of Christ. So we're going to talk about that today. As a quick review, we'll talk about what we've been discussing. Saul, as the anointed king who had been rejected by the Lord and replaced by David. David had become a hero to the Israelites by defeating Goliath. He was taken into the household of Saul. He was raised as a warrior. And over the next several years, Saul became jealous, attempted to kill him on several occasions. David fled, became a Philistine immigrant at one point, hid down in the Philistine territories where Saul would be unable to get to him. The Philistines went to Mount Gilboa to meet Saul in a major battle, and the Israelites, David was denied the opportunity to march with the Philistines and return to his home in the southern part of Israel, a place called Ziklag, and then Saul died at the battle on Mount Gilboa, Saul and his 3 sons. At this point, it would become safe for David to return to Israel, and he inquired of the Lord, "Where shall I go?" as it says here, and the Lord said, "Go to Hebron." Hebron was the major city in the central area of the tribal allotment for the tribe of Judah. Actually, Judah got about half of the area that we call Israel today. They got the biggest allotment. And it says that the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So he has finally become king. This is about 1010 BC. He's king only of one small tribal allotment at that point. Up north, there is a surviving son of Saul whose name is Ishbosheth. His primary general is a man by the name of Abner. Now, David and all of his men know Abner. Abner knows David. They had all been in the house of Saul for a while before David fled. So these are all people that know each other, and it has become a bit of a civil war now. It's just like the American Civil War. All of the generals knew each other because they'd all gone to West Point together before the secession. And it says that Abner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and made him king over all Israel. Now, when they're talking about Israel, they're talking about everything except the tribe of Judah. David has the tribe of Judah. Ishbosheth has been placed over the remaining tribes, in other words, all of the areas that Saul had originally controlled. And it says that Ishbosheth was 40 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 2 years. And the house of Judah followed David. In other words, the tribe of Judah. The length of time David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. What happened at that point was referred to as a war. It says the war between the house of Saul and the house of David. It wasn't a war. Little border skirmishes, small groups would contest with one another. And it says it lasted a long time, but it only lasted for 2 years. And it says David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Ishbosheth was a very weak individual. Abner was the power behind the throne. And at one point, 2 groups had met, Abner and Joab and his brothers, and they had a bit of a military contest, and what happened was a brother of Joab, the main general of David, happened to be David's nephew. Joab was the son of David's sister. Now, we don't know if they're the same age or he had an older sister and they're contemporaries or whether Joab is younger, but this Joab that we read about for 40 years during the reign of David was one of his best friends, and it was also his nephew. And the brothers of Joab were pursuing Abner, and Abner killed one of the brothers of Joab. Asahel is his name. It says Asahel refused to give up the pursuit, so Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Asahel's stomach, and he died on the spot. Now, things deteriorated up north, and Abner, apparently behind the back of Ishbosheth, came down to David and said, let's cut a deal. They had some negotiations. It says Abner sent messages to say to David, I will help you bring all Israel over to you. In other words, we can bring the northern tribes under your reign. He and David agreed in some fashion, and Abner started to leave just as Joab arrived. And it says to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed Abner in the stomach and he died. Now, he did this without David's permission. He did it without warning. This creates a blood debt for Joab, which David had felt he was responsible for, and David never forgave Joab for it, and 40 years later on his deathbed, he told Solomon, you have to kill Joab for me to avenge this blood death. So anyway, that's the background there, and then what happened was, with Abner gone, Ishbosheth was unable to hold the throne. 2 assassins came in, killed him, and it says they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron. We've talked about taking the heads. Every time you kill somebody, you take the head off and walk in with it to show who it was. And they came in. David was horrified that a king had been assassinated. The argument is that David was upset that an anointed of God had been assassinated, but there are some cynics who will argue that maybe David didn't want the precedent set. The king could be killed, and then so for whatever reason, David was horrified. He had the 2 assassins killed, and then it goes on to say all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron, and they anointed David king over Israel. So here we are 2 years after the death of Saul. David is now king of everything. He's taken over the territory that had been controlled by Saul. David was 30 years old when he became king. The battle of Elah Valley against Goliath was probably about 1025. That's where we get that 15-year-old David. He was 30 when he became king, and that other battle had been about 15 years earlier. So those numbers are very casual. We don't know that those are correct, but at any rate, David was 30 when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. This is not one of those possibly symbolic 40s, because the Bible goes on. It says he reigned in Hebron for 7 years, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 33. 33 and 7 is 40, so he reigned a real 40, whereas 40 days and 40 nights and 40 years and Solomon 40 and all of the various judges that judged for 40, those are, some of them, obviously symbolic numbers that mean about 40 or a full generation, and we simply don't know what that means. But David ruled for 40 years. So let's take a look at that. If we look north, the reddish area that's labeled Saul shows the territory that Saul controlled. Now, the entire area had been allotted to various tribes, but the Philistines had taken over the coast, and Israelites simply didn't live down there. It was dangerous. They hadn't lived down there for a couple of 100 years, even though territory had been given to them. David was sent back from Mount Gilboa, and he went to Ziklag, which is someplace way down in the south. We don't know where that is. Meanwhile, the Philistines went north, and they fought the battle of Mount Gilboa, in which Saul died. And David, down there in Ziklag, is now free to return to the territory that had been controlled by Saul. Saul's gone. The Lord said, go to Hebron. Hebron is in the hill country overlooking the Dead Sea. It's right in the middle of the tribal allotment of Judah. And so David went to Hebron, and the men of Judah anointed him king over their territory. And you can see that's about half the territory that Saul had. The Judahites got the biggest piece of property. Ishbosheth controlled the remainder. The areas that had been under the control of Saul were up north, but after a couple of years, some assassins killed him. And so Ishbosheth was gone, and the people of the north, the various tribal leaders, came down to David and said, would you consent to be our king? I'm sure very humbly he agreed, and he ended up, at that point, controlling all of the territory that had been controlled by Saul. Now, you still have the Philistines down on the coast. You still have enemies all the way around the outside. You have Amalekites and Ammonites and Edomites and Moabites. And you have Arameans up to the north. All of these various tribal groups will eventually be conquered by David, and he will and the Philistines. And he will extend his territory out to the kingdom of David. But at this particular point, he is controlling a small area of land which has been defeated by the Philistines. They aren't occupying the territory, but they have conquered that area. They're exacting tribute. They're controlling the area, and so David has a major task ahead of him to consolidate the territories. He decided after 7 years that he wanted to live in Jerusalem and establish his royal palace at that point. It's more centrally located. Jerusalem is a tiny little town of 10 acres at this point, off the main trade routes, but it's more central. It's heavily fortified. It's a magnificently fortified city, but it's only about 10 acres. And depending on how many people live in a house, various populations have been calculated anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000, but it's a small population, and depending on how many people are living in the house, you can inflate it or deflate those numbers. So he went up, and it says he conquered the city of Jerusalem. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Bible also refers to this as the city of Jebus. The Jebusites lived there. Eventually it becomes Zion. It becomes the city of David. It has lots of different names, but at this particular time, Jerusalem or Jebus, whichever you want to call it. The Jebusites, standing on the walls, the battlements of this fortified city, said to David, you will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off. And they thought David cannot get in here. And the fact remains he couldn't. There's no way that David, with his relatively small contingent of men on foot, no siege equipment in those days, armed with spears and bows and slings, would be able to take the city of Jerusalem. In those days, if you wanted to conquer a city, you either had to break in through the gates, and the gates were most heavily fortified, or you had to besiege the city, put your army around the outside, and wait till they starved. That might take, in some cases, 2 or 3 years, as the city of Samaria did. And David didn't have the resources. You have to provide for your army. I mean, he could not have besieged the city, or you do it by stealth or by a trick. And there's a very famous city that was taken by trickery. Anybody? Troy, absolutely. And that's what happened here. Now, the problem is, the current wisdom is that Jerusalem was not even occupied as a major city at the time of David. David never existed, and this entire narrative is dismissed as a fiction. That's the conventional wisdom today. That's what our kids are being taught in school. Well, that's not true. And I'm going to show you a new discovery just within the last few years that nobody seems to want to talk about because, obviously, it's an embarrassment to the conventional wisdom. But it shows that these stories actually took place. Incidentally, the blind and the lame, there are 2 schools of thought there. You have these battlements. The city of Jerusalem was a long, narrow oval on a spur of land, I'll show you in a moment, with deep valleys on each side and to the south. The only place you could attack it was on the northern end where it was a little bit flat. Coming up the sides was impossible, and on these battlements they had blind and lame people, and there are those that would argue that they did it to humiliate the Israelites, making fun of them, saying, look at this, we don't even have soldiers up here. But there is another school of thought that the blind and the lame were regarded with a certain amount of respect and fear as being marked by the gods, and as a talisman, they had put the blind and the lame up there. Take your pick. It doesn't really matter. At this point, the people inside the city were fairly convinced that David would be unable to conquer the city. Nevertheless, and then the Bible goes on and says David captured the fortress of Zion, the city of Jerusalem, the city of David. They're already calling it the city of David in the very next verse, and they don't tell us how he did it. It's frustrating. You know, if we were writing the history today, they'd spell it out. But they don't. What they do is they give us one little clue. It says, on that day, David said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach the lame and the blind who are David's enemies. And then it goes on to say he conquered the city. That doesn't tell us anything. Now, in those days, all of the Canaanite cities were built on mounds, either man-made or natural high places, because they're more defensible that way. And they'd put a wall around it, but the problem is the water table is always down here. And if you can't control your water supply at a time that an enemy is attacking you, and they attack in the summer and capture your water supply, within a couple of weeks you will be forced to surrender. So all cities made a huge attempt to fortify their water supplies. They built walls around them. They dug tunnels down to go over to them, like at Megiddo. They dug vertical wells, but they did something to fortify and protect their water supply. The conventional wisdom says that those silly Canaanites in Jerusalem never did that. But every city had some kind of a tunnel arrangement or vertical shafts that they would use to get to their water from the cities up here to the water table down here, and it had to be within the city walls somewhere. It says then that David took up residence in the fortress after conquering it and called it the city of David. And it's called that from there. Mount Zion, incidentally, is various parts of the city of Jerusalem, and it changes location in the Bible, but Zion generally refers to the whole area. So let's take a look here. This is an aerial reconstruction of the geography of Jerusalem. There is a valley that runs north and south called the Kidron Valley, and incidentally, that's the valley across which Jesus went to get to the Garden of Gethsemane the night before he was crucified. There's another very, very deep valley called the Hinnom Valley that loops around a major plateau. And then there used to be a valley that ran up the center called the Central Valley. That's all filled in now. All of the years of destruction of the city, you have all that rubble when the houses are knocked down. You have to push it someplace, and they all kind of pushed it into that Central Valley. So it's been fairly well filled in. The Mount of Olives is a ridge of hills off to the east. And the slope of the Mount of Olives is the Garden of Gethsemane. So Jesus crossed the Kidron Valley and went to the Garden of Gethsemane. That little spur of land there is where the city of Jerusalem was located at the time of David. Tiny little city, 10 acres. The area to the north was the threshing field of Arana, which David bought, and then Solomon placed the temple there, extended the city walls, built himself a fantastic palace and administrative buildings, and filled that whole area in. With the passage of time, what's called the Western Hill was eventually filled in. So, this is a photograph. It was probably taken about 50 years ago, but with the shadows, it gives you a very good sense of where the original city of David was located. There's the Kidron Valley. There's that filled-in Central Valley, and the city of David is that yellow area there, 10 acres, tiny little place. And then the temple would go up there on that area that you can see, and that's the city of Solomon, the blue and the yellow. But that's the city of David, and the question is, why in the world would you build a city in that spot, on that little spur of land? And the reason is the only water that can be located in that part of the country is down in that valley, the Gihon Spring. So they built the city where the Gihon Spring is, and the question is, how do you get the water up to the city, and how do you protect the Gihon Spring? Up until 10 years ago, it was agreed that the spring was unfortified, and those silly people, those silly Canaanites, didn't fortify their spring, whereas every other city in the ancient world did. But David said anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft. There must be something associated with the Gihon Spring. That's what the water shaft would be, and that's what people have been looking for 100 years. This is a reconstruction of the city that was drawn probably about 15 years ago. It's being modified. I'll show you as each year they discover more things and they modify the drawing. But 15 years ago, if you take a look, this is the way they thought the city of Jerusalem was located. And the Gihon Spring was outside the walls, which is absurd. You could gain access through a little tunnel and steps leading down to the spring, but the walls were up there, and the people in the city could in no way protect their spring. That made no sense to me 25 years ago, and now it doesn't make sense to anybody because of new discoveries. If you take a cross-section through the hill right there at the spring, there was a man who was considered probably insane by the Arabs living in Jerusalem. They thought he was a silly man at the very least. His name was Warren. In the middle 1800s, was poking around and digging around the city of Jerusalem. And this is the cross-section through the hill there. The city wall would have been built about halfway down. We have all the foundations. We know that. Why don't you build the city wall up at the top? Well, it's very narrow up there, first of all. If you build it down a little bit, you can kind of terrace a few more houses. Why not build it at the bottom? Because that gives very good access to the attacking armies down there in the bottom, so they build it about halfway up. The Gihon Spring was outside, approached by a little tunnel. Well, this fellow Warren was poking around, and he discovered a tunnel that ran from inside the city to an area. It was still in the hill, but it was beyond the walls. Came to a dead end, and he dug around in that area, and there was a vertical shaft that was filled in, went right down to the Gihon Spring. And so we have an answer for David's water shaft. The thought was that the army could come in and capture the spring, and those silly Canaanites weren't even defending it, so David was able to capture it. He was able to get to that shaft, which would be used to draw water during a time of siege. They could lower their buckets down, and they climbed up the shaft, overpowered any guards that were there, worked their way back into the city, and that would give them access to the gates, and they could go and open a gate and allow the Israelite army to attack. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Except there's a problem. It can't be. It can't be Warren's shaft. That was the only game in town for about 100 years. Anybody who believed that the story of David was correct fixated on the Warren shaft, and you'll see that in all of the books that talk about the archaeology of Jerusalem, because it was the only game in town. There was no other alternative, and as it turns out, that can't be Warren shaft for several reasons. First of all, the shaft is not vertical. If you're going to use it to draw water and it's angled, you can't get a bucket down. Second of all, it's only about this big around. Third of all, it's very rough inside. It's almost triangular in shape with rocks sticking out. If you tried to draw a bucket up, it would snag and spill the water. If you were going to use it to draw water, you would core it out, make it into a vertical shaft, and nobody ever did. The coup de grace for that particular theory was done probably in the 1990s. Some geologists went in and took a look and said that didn't even exist at the time of David. That's a crack that came open later. So now we had nothing, absolutely nothing to support the theory of David, and that's the way it was until the year 2000. The Gihon Spring's a big deal for tourists. They bring buses in, and the year 2000 was to be the 3,000th anniversary of David's Jerusalem. He took the city about 1000 BC, 2000 AD, 3000 years. It makes kind of a nice number, and it's close. And they were trying to enlarge the parking lot down there where the buses go, and they stumbled upon some amazingly big stones. Let's take a look here. Oh, incidentally, one other thing. The backside of the Gihon Spring was tunneled out by Hezekiah to take water over to the other side of the city around 700 BC, and water then flowed from the Gihon Spring out to the other side of the city. I'll show you that in a moment. So that's Hezekiah's tunnel. That wasn't there at the time of David. This is 300 years later. Here's the steps. Those are Middle Bronze Age metal stairs. That's the slope. That was obviously stepped, and this was dug out of the bedrock. Whatever this tunnel was, and they're not quite sure what the tunnel was for that Warren found, but this was all filled in with rubble. You get down to the bottom, there's a horizontal tunnel, and look at that. They dug it right out of the bedrock in the Bronze Age. And it comes to a dead end. You can see metal steps leading up on the right, but that's Warren's shaft. And if you look down Warren's shaft, you can see that it's very irregular in shape. Down at the bottom, it's about 30 feet down. And the shaft itself, that didn't exist at the time of David. But for a lot of years when I was leading tours to Israel, we said maybe this is where Joab came up the shaft to attack the city. Now, the back end of it there, and that pointing up to excavations that started about 2000 AD, and the back of the tunnel there, you can see is dead end. They started digging in through that. They went along the hillside, and today it's more formally protected with the steps, and people can go up and go through it. But this is what they found. These enormous boulders and steps in the hillside, and they were starting to talk about secret tunnels. About 1999, 2000, they were talking about new tunnels being discovered. These aren't tunnels. This is where the hillside had covered everything over, and they're digging inside. They've removed all that dirt and exposed it. You'd come in through a little door there, and they had put up a concrete retaining wall so that their excavations didn't collapse in on them. But look at this. This is a major tower made with enormous boulders. That's Dr. Collins there, standing there. You can see the effort that went into this. This predates David. Nobody knew that was there until 15 years ago. You can see the retaining walls on the side of the hill there. This is a very steep hill, below which is the spring, and they had to put a retaining wall in there. And then they built a box, a fortified box around the spring that attached to the city walls. In other words, they weren't these silly Canaanites that left their spring unprotected. They had a massive fortification around it, and nobody knew it. And because they hadn't found it, they claimed that David didn't exist. Now they found it. And so the Gihon Spring, which in 1990 was regarded as that, is now regarded as maybe something like that with a box around it. This is a reconstruction maybe 10 years ago of what that fortification looked like. A huge cistern reservoir. The spring would fill that up, and the people from the city could come down and go into this area to draw their water. And it was well protected from any attacking army. But it still doesn't give us any way that David got into the city. Until they started doing some excavation around there, and they stumbled upon a tunnel that had been filled in and completely forgotten probably 2,000 years ago. It's a tunnel that runs along the side of the hill, below the walls, and while it's underground, it goes directly into the enclosure that has the spring. Now, what in the world is that for? Well, this is a more recent reconstruction of the city. You can see the long, narrow spur of land, and it's now thought that there was maybe an actual complex of guards and whatnot around the spring, so it's much bigger, but they found this tunnel. And we know from various documents that the Kidron Valley down at the bottom was agricultural land, and the current theory is that this long tunnel was an irrigation trench that flowed water out and down into the Kidron Valley. It's buried in the ground. And the way they dug it into the bedrock, maybe 8 or 10 feet, that making a channel, rolled big boulders down on top of it, and then covered it over with dirt so nobody knew it was there, except it runs along the hillside and dead ends down near the south end of the city. So if Joab were able to break in and use that tunnel to get inside the Gihon Spring and then overpower the guards and open some gates, we now have David's water shaft. And this is real. This existed prior to David. And so we can perhaps consider that Joab was able to sneak in. He would have had to dig in. It's underground. But if he knew it was there and the guards weren't there and they didn't consider it to be worth worrying about, he could have overpowered the guards, taken control of the city that way. This is just in the last few years. This is open to the public. We can take people through it. It's called the Canaanite Dry Shaft or Dry Tunnel because no water runs through it now. But nobody's talking about it. There's no consideration whatsoever that this has a link to the Bible story because we just don't talk about Bible stories anymore. This is the tunnel. It's huge. Those are a couple of ladies on one of our tours. You can see the rock over their head. These great big boulders were down into the horizontal area. It had to be various depths because you have to get the grade just right to carry the water down. It's an engineering feat. They start at the spring and it slowly goes downhill. And depending on where it's located in the hill, it can be large or small. You can see various areas along there, but plenty big enough for a man to walk through. David's tunnel. David's water shaft. So, I wanted to show you Jerusalem before we finish up, just to give you a sense of the city. This is the city as it existed at the time of David, according to what we now know. With the fortification around the spring, that's an ongoing excavation. Every year it's a little bit different. You go back every year and they have a picture of what it looked like, and I just took a series of pictures, and they're different every year because you get a better understanding. Solomon was able to develop the hill to the north. David bought that. That's the threshing field of Araunah. And what Solomon did was build the temple there. Well, that's the city that Solomon controlled. And that's the city that existed for the next couple of 100 years probably. Solomon doubled the size of the city, so now maybe we're talking about 3,000 or 4,000 people within the walls, and then towns all around the outside that support the central town. By about 700, the Assyrians were attacking up north, and they destroyed Samaria, and they were destroying multiple cities, and you had a huge flood of refugees coming south, fleeing the Assyrians, and they came to Jerusalem for protection. And the question is, what do you do with them? Well, they settled them on the western hill there, built walls around it, and that's the city that existed until the Babylonians destroyed it, and then eventually this was rebuilt at the time of the Romans. But the question is, where do they get their water? This is Hezekiah. Hezekiah built a tunnel under the southern end of Jerusalem there, which carried water from the spring over to that central valley, and then he corrected the city walls to create a dam along the bottom of the area there, and that filled up with water from the spring, and it created a huge reservoir, which then provided water for the western hill. That area is called the Pool of Siloam. That's the Siloam Pool, which in Roman times was fancified. It was decorated and made very elegant, but the Siloam Pool was a feature of the water coming from the Gihon Spring. Now, by the time of the Romans, they had filled in that whole city. That's called the Upper City now. And up at the very top, a fellow by the name of Herod the Great built a palace. He had a beautiful view of the temple and so forth. And he determined at that point that the temple was not elegant enough. And he did a major expansion of that area, as you can see right there. Put in that huge platform that's there today. He increased the size of the temple by building around the existing temple. He didn't replace it. That would have been blasphemous. So he enlarged the structure controlling the central rooms of the temple. And you can see that. That's what's there today. There was a suburb that developed out to the north. And there was a hill located to the northwest there that is not, that at that time was not within the city walls. That hill is Golgotha to most people, and that's where Christ was crucified. That is now within the current city walls, which were put there in the 1500s by Suleiman the Magnificent. They redid the city walls when they rebuilt them, and so you have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre there, but that was outside the city walls at the time of Christ. Now, what happened to that city? Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, and he pointed, and his disciples said, look at that magnificent building. And Jesus said, I tell you, not one stone will be left standing upon another. Herod had spent 40-some years building that temple. It had just been completed around the time of Christ. They started it around 18 BC, and it took 40-some years to complete it. And Jesus said, that's all going to be gone. And 30 years later, the Romans destroyed the city, everything. So that's the city of Jerusalem. We'll be talking about that a little bit more, but I wanted you to be aware of how it's laid out, and we'll talk about that more in the future. One quick question: how could they overlook this? How in the world could they conclude that there was no fortification around the spring? And the answer is they never found it, and the reason they didn't find it is because they weren't looking for it and they didn't look in the right place. The original city would have been built on the hilltop there. This is a cross-section through the hill. The spring down below. And way back when, in the Middle Bronze Age, they put a wall around the city about halfway down and then built that box around the spring. We now know that. They found the foundations, but the problem is you have multiple destructions of Jerusalem. And eventually the Gihon Spring was abandoned as a water source, and people just didn't know it was there. And over 2,000 years, what happened was the hill slowly shifted, ended up covering up all of these foundations, and they just didn't dig deep enough. Kathleen Kenyon, the great young female archaeologist who was lionized by the Brits in the 1950s, 1960s, was excavating this area, and she exclaimed that everything that could be found has been found. There's nothing left to find in this area. Well, as it turns out, there was a major discovery that she didn't find, and it's just been uncovered, and unfortunately nobody's talking about it, but we have it now. That's David's water shaft. I'm going to quit. We have time for a couple of questions. I never leave enough time. I'm sorry. Does anybody have any comments or questions about any of that?
Is that lady still living now?
Kathleen Kenyon? No. She had a bachelor's degree and began excavating, and the British absolutely loved her. She was kind of a superstar in the papers and so on, and she did a lot of excavation, but it turns out she was really sloppy, never kept any records, never published anything, and she's wrong about most of what she did. But at the time, she was considered the premier archaeologist of this area, and if she had dug just a couple of feet deeper, she'd have stumbled on all of this. There was another question?
Strategic reason why Jerusalem wouldn't take the coastline, the Mediterranean coastline, north of the Philistines? It seemed like the whole territory they had was inland. Did they not want the territory on the water for trade?
The question is, why didn't Jerusalem control everything down to the coast? With the arrival of the Israelites, back during the conquest, right after the Exodus, you had relatively unprepared Israelites and who lived a semi-nomadic life for the next couple of hundred years. So they lived in the hill country. Down along the coast was the major trade route that went through all of the big Canaanite cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Megiddo, Hatzor, and these were all controlled by major city-states. And so the Israelites weren't even welcome down there. If they had wandered down with their sheep and their flocks, they would have been driven out. So they stayed up in the relatively unsettled areas, which allowed the Philistines to come in and take over the coastal region in the 1100s when they came in.
Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God. At BibleInteract.tv, you will penetrate the scriptures of the Bible. At our store, you're just one click away from owning your favorite books, DVDs, or study guides. Earn a degree from our university. and watch hundreds of video presentations from biblical scholars, archaeologists, and theologians. By subscribing to Bible Interact, you'll find all the resources you'll need, so why not subscribe today? Go to www.bibleinteract.tv. You'll be glad you did. Interested in studying more about the temple, the Messiah, or what God's plan is for our future? No problem. We've got you covered. With more than 200 DVDs, books, and workbooks, you'll find the answers you've been searching for. Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the Kingdom of God.